The line that struck me today was in the first reading from the letter to the Hebrews, as the author is talking about the difference between the high priest from among men versus Jesus as the great high priest who was chosen by Almighty God. It says, "In the days when he was in the flesh, he offered prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears," the agony in the garden, the crucifixion, "to the one who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered. And when he was made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him." Son though he was, he learned obedience. And so as I prayed through this, I'm not going to say I got a whole lot of light. It was a struggle saying, what does this mean? Obviously, Jesus as God fully knows all. How can he learn? And yet we know in his humanity he does learn. And somehow there is obedience that is learned through suffering. You know, it's easy to be obedient to God when things make sense, when it's in the way that we would expect or want. It's hard to be obedient to God when it requires our suffering and when we don't understand. You know, there's plenty of times in my life it's like, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, God, I'll do that. But when it's, where are you leading, God? I have no idea what's going on right now. That becomes hard, and yet that's where real obedience to Almighty God is learned. In those moments of, I just have to surrender to you, and especially in those moments of suffering. You know, I was thinking about this a lot this morning. I was like, I can say with some brutal honesty, I don't like suffering. I don't know if any of you do. If you do, you probably should go see a psychotherapist to help you with that. I don't like suffering. And yet there is something that we learn from suffering. Those times of the greatest agony of my life, usually it's not physical suffering as much as it is some sort of spiritual or at least emotional suffering. In those deepest moments of agony in my life, that's where I've learned a deeper trust in Almighty God, a growth in holiness, a separation from my own selfishness. At least I learned that for a little while. I'll keep going back to it. That's the problem. But Jesus, in being obedient to death, even death on a cross, was tested, as it were, not like an exam, but as that metal was tested within him, he became and learned obedience. And I think in those moments that we especially don't like, moments of suffering, that's when we learn the deepest obedience. It is out of obedience that I've gone to every assignment that I've been given. I tell you, there's never a once that I've said, oh, I'm glad to be out of this place, moving on to this new place. Never a once. When the diocese calls me and says, I want to give you this new responsibility, rarely do I say, oh, that sounds wonderful. And yet, in the obedience to Almighty God, through the bishop, I learn to see God's finger in my life. I learn obedience. And in that obedience, I find a deeper peace. And so then, Jesus shows us, he's that witness, he's the example of obedience even through the greatest suffering, to show us, with his help, we can do it too. And then, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. Now that invitation to obey Jesus, so that he can be our salvation. I know in our culture today, obey is a 4-letter word. But let us ask Almighty God for that grace of obedience. obedience to Him, to His will, to His love moving in our life, even or maybe especially when we can't understand it. Even or maybe especially when it causes some suffering, so that we can see the resurrection that comes through that suffering, through that death of ourself, and in that obedience find the salvation God has for us.